Bob Costas. That is the nothing personal word of the day. It's a Samson sit down, and we are lucky. For the first time, we have a two-time Samson sit down. You remember him from 2 years ago. You remember him as the face of every memory you have. Bob Costas, welcome to Nothing Personal. How are you?
That's a bit of an overstatement. Every memory
Every
that a person
memory to me is you.
everything. It's not even true that I'm attached to every memory in sports, but every memory. Let's just expand it to the entire universe. Entertainment, literature, the arts, whatever it may be. Somehow I'm connected.
Every personal memory. I'd like to believe that you could do play-by-play of every part of every person's life, and you would make it compelling.
On occasion, after a glass or two of wine, some of my compatriots have compelled me to do that with the most mundane of things, and I'm able to render it in a fairly entertaining fashion.
One of the things that actually has come up very recently is we're now with the NBA Finals and the Stanley Cup, and we're baseball sort of in the middle of the season. People are longing for the great narratives of Bob Costas as though it is this treasure that has disappeared. And I keep explaining to people when asking, because people undoubtedly ask, do you know Bob Costas? Well, yes, I've known him a long time. Why did this happen? I said, because people can't do it. And people misunderstand that fact.
Uh, Others have a piece of the credit. You know, Dick Ebersol created a storytelling ethos at NBC Sports, which he had learned from Roone Arledge at ABC. And so everything we did, the Olympics, MLB, football, but maybe the signature of it all was the NBA in the 90s, because Michael Jordan and the Bulls dynasty were such a compelling story. And so the idea was to take things that were true narratives. There was actually a journalistic element to it. This is the true narrative of the game, or what we're anticipating up to this point, but then dramatize it and do it, we hoped, in a thoughtful and skillful way. One of the best, though, you may remember this. In fact, I'm sure you do, from 1997 with the Marlins, even though the 2003 championship is the one for which you have the ring. But in 97, it goes to a game seven. And
I watched it.
Game seven, as you may remember. And it's knocking around somewhere on YouTube. We did this opening, most of it dedicated to Jim Leland and his journey, never played a day in the big leagues. And on the mound for the other team, the then Cleveland Indians, is Jarrett Wright, who spent like a year and a half in the minor leagues. He was pitching high school ball like 3 years prior to that. Now he's starting game seven of the World Series. All that stuff was true and could just be simply stated. Or it could be dramatized in a way where people who are already keyed up for game seven said, man, I can't wait for the first pitch. That was our intention.
It must be overwhelming to think about the impact that you have on people. So I'm going to make you feel old, but don't, please. In 1994, I was out of law school delivering newspapers in Europe. But when it came to game seven of the Knicks Rockets, I went to Houston to the game because the Knicks were my life. I love them. Yeah. And at the time, in order to record something, I had a VCR and VHS tapes. Sure. And what I taped for game seven was only the pregame, because I was going to the game, but I did not want to miss how it was going to be introduced. And I will never forget the despondent feeling of them losing the game seven. To this day, my worst day in sports, including an 18-year career in baseball. But that game seven was the worst day of my sports career. But I still went back and listened to your intro, and it made me feel like the Knicks could still win that game.
Well, since you brought it up, I'll tell you an interesting story about that intro. My son, Keith, who has been at the Major League Baseball Network a long time now, as a producer, and during the offseason when they do their morning show, Hot Stove, he gets on the air, he produces and researches his own segment. So he grew up around sports. I took him to his first NBA final when he was just 6 years old in the early 90s, because school was always out when the NBA finals started. And if it was the World Series, he came to the weekend games 3, 4, and 5, wherever they might have been. And so he happened to be with me, for example, in 97 for that game seven against the Marlins. And he would have been what? Then he would have been 11. Okay. 1994, he's traveling with me. We're in Houston. He's 8 years old. And he says to me the day before game seven, There was a 3-day break. Game 6 was a Sunday. Game 7 was a Wednesday. And we're hanging around the hotel. And he's a regular, like at practice. Michael Jordan knows him by name. Shaquille O'Neal got off an elevator once at the Ritz-Carlton in Houston, where the Orlando Magic was staying in '95 when they played the Rockets in the final. He gets off the elevator, and I'm standing there, and he looks right past me, and he goes, "Keith Costas," and gives him a high five, but he had to go low to get down to Keith. Anyway, so he's absorbed all this stuff. He's 8 years old. He says to me, "Dad, the game is tomorrow. You haven't even written the teas." And I say jokingly, "Why don't you write it?" And by then, he had internalized the tropes and the form. No lie. Okay. He'd internalized it. He said, "Okay, this is what it is. 2 teams, and you see the Knicks and you see the Rockets. 2 coaches, you see Tomjanovich, you see Riley. 2 superstars, you see Ewing, you see Olajuwon. But now, only 1 game, 1 winner."
Don't tell me this.
Game 7 next. I swear. All right. All I added to that was, at the beginning, you may know it by heart now, since it seems like you've got it somewhere on the old VCR. I said, Game 7, 2 words filled with anticipation and a history of drama. And I only remember that because I think back so fondly on what Keith came up with. All the rest of it, virtually verbatim, is what he suggested. But then John Gilmartin, whose name is not widely known, John Gilmartin produced most of those pieces. And he put the most dramatic possible pictures, history of Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and Willis Reed limping out in Game 7 in 1970, and Magic and Larry Bird. And he used the music from The Gladiator. You know,
that series was like 2 gladiators.
Yes. So without that, without, in this case, Keith Costas, who gets a writing credit, and without John Gilmartin, who gets the producer's credit, you know, they both serve to elevate me. But it's true that an 8-year-old kid basically wrote that.
Are you given a hard out for those? Do you have a time that you have to do those in, or do they just say whatever you want, Bob, you have?
That's a good question. I think generally they were between 145 and 215. But in the case of Game 7 of the World Series in '97, the Marlins and the Indians, it was longer than that. You know, as long as we had enough time, and generally we did. Generally, there was a half-hour pregame before an NBA Finals or before a World Series game. So if we had enough time and the content deserved it, then we could push it.
How does a Game 7 ever not deserve it? Every Game 7 has to deserve it. Although now you know, in the 90s, it was very uncommon. And I was just talking about this on Nothing Personal. Road teams didn't win Game 7s. It just did not happen. And now it seems that home court advantage has really changed in the NBA in a way that I never dreamt would happen.
David, I don't remember the exact stat, but I think it was something like, because I cited it, there was a Game 7 between the Knicks and the Pacers in the Eastern Conference Final that year in '94, which the Knicks, the home team, did win to get
94-90.
Yeah, there you go. And then a Game 7 with the Knicks on the road against the Rockets. And I think at that point it was something like 20 or 22 consecutive Game 7s won by the home team throughout, not only the finals, throughout the NBA playoffs. And it held that year for the Rockets.
Do you feel that people should stick with who they brought to the dance as it relates to both broadcasters, as it relates to players? The way Pat Riley described why he was going to stay with John Starks in Game 7 when he shot 2 for 18, and he had a great answer, which is we're not here but for John Starks. And I've been thinking a lot about loyalty. And not as it necessarily pertains to solely you, but clearly when what networks are dealing in now is not loyalty as much as it is dollar signs. And that has been another one of, I would assume, the 10,000 changes you've seen in your career.
Yeah, most of that doesn't affect who gets assigned to the game, but it does affect, in some cases, how the game is produced. Networks are looking to cut corners. In some instances where once there was a stage manager behind you who can be, if not essential, certainly valuable, handing you the reads, the promos and whatnot, or pointing out, we're going to bring this camera in, whatever it might be. Now there's a small monitor, smaller than an iPad, in front of the play-by-play guy in some instances, and then he reads the stuff off of that. I've been involved in broadcasts. This started in COVID, and then they found out that they could do it. Now we're essentially post-COVID, but in some instances, the only people that are actually there are the announcers and maybe a stat man. And all of it is being directed and produced from network headquarters. That's kind of new, and in some instances, it has a negative effect on the broadcast.
Tell me how, because I'm curious. Tell me how, because then I want to understand the argument that one would make to increase the expense in order to increase the quality.
Well, now during COVID, when people were just making do, this was completely understandable. Let's say you're doing a baseball game during COVID. A lot of guys did dozens of them, if not more. I did only 2 or 3 from the MLB network in Secaucus. And luckily, none of them got caught in the circumstance that I'm about to describe. But if you're calling a game, you're up in the booth, you're looking at the monitor, you're seeing what the people at home are seeing, generally center field camera as the pitch is delivered. There's another one off to the side. It's the isolated camera. You know what they might go to, shot of someone in the stands or the manager, whatever. But if the ball is hit in the gap, even the best director cannot possibly get to all of that simultaneously. The cuts are usually excellent, but you've got to use the naked eye to see, A, where are the runners? B, what's the third base coach doing? C, where's the ball now? Now you're thinking, how good is the right fielder's arm? If you're doing that from a studio and you're relying only on the cuts, you don't have the sense of anticipation. The guy's going to stop at third. No, he's going to try. Is it a foolish and reckless risk, or is he likely to be safe? All those things play out in real time, and without being able to use the naked eye from the booth, you're screwed really if you're at the mercy of that kind of remote situation.
But the cost to you, it's nails on a chalkboard. To executives, it's dollars in a P&L, and the plays you're describing in what was then 3.5-hour broadcast, what is now a 2-hour and 38-minute broadcast, 3 times, 3 plays where that could happen. It's hard to justify. COVID, to me, I wonder if you found this in your area of expertise. COVID just made everything come faster that was coming anyway. Yeah. People saw what it was. You didn't have to travel for every meeting. People saw you didn't, right? And you used to have to go to every meeting. And then Zoom happened.
Some of that makes sense. It's actually more efficient. You can get more done. I do find it odd, though, when there's just 2 people and a phone call would suffice, and the person reflexively says, I'll send you a Zoom link. Why is that necessary? Here, do this. I actually still have a landline in addition to a cell phone. Pick it up and call me.
Now, that may make you the oldest of anyone you know, that you still have. You actually answer your house phone?
It doesn't ring very often. No. But if you're doing a radio interview and there really is no video element to it, a landline is more effective and the quality is better generally than a cell phone.
I used to get asked that when I started my broadcasting career, and that was only in early 18. Will you be joining us from a landline? Now right. It's not even a question anymore. So that clearly, what do you drink for your throat, given that you talk for a living?
Not this smoothie, which my wife brought back from her shopping expedition for me just before we started this. Usually, depending on the weather too, hot tea with some lemon and honey is usually pretty good. Vin Scully always said that he preferred Jolly Rancher. He had like Jolly Rancher drops because you can't be drinking water all the time during the game because you don't want to have to get up and use the restroom, but you want to keep your throat moist. So between innings, he would suck on one of those Jolly Ranchers and then toss it aside. He had like 20 of them, up in the booth with him. But generally, you need something that's going to wet your whistle, so to speak.
Yeah, Jolly Ranchers last a really long time. You can't possibly down one in a 2.5-minute in between inning break.
Oh, so I wasn't.
And you can't hide it either in your mouth. It's too big.
I wasn't peering over Vin's shoulder, so maybe he put it back in the wrapper gingerly, and then in the next half inning he continued until it was gone.
We're talking about times that have changed. And it's not that we're longing for the old days, because I don't want to come off to the audience or to anybody as being that guy. That's not who we are. But where we try to live is in the inefficiencies of today, in a world where everyone claims everyone's more efficient. We're talking about Zoom versus landline, et cetera. And I was thinking about your first Olympics, because we're about to do the Olympics. What year was the first time you broadcast the Olympics?
1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul, Korea.
So can you help me understand from 88 to today as a broadcaster, and you don't have to make it just about the Olympics, what are the top two changes that you think have had a deleterious impact on the audience or that have had a positive impact?
Well, from a research standpoint, you can get so much more information so much more rapidly than ever before. It's all right there at your fingertips. And at Olympics, for example, you've got a battalion of researchers. They've prepared for this. There's voluminous research to begin with. If something happens that isn't in the research manuals, and those manuals used to be thick notebooks, and now it's all obviously on a link and all at your fingertips. But if something happens which is not in the preparation, they can put something together very, very rapidly and put it in front of the host or the play-by-play announcer.
So you did everything manually? So you would get a research packet this big doing the Olympics, and you'd have to highlight it, and then at an event when something happened, it's the 4th gold medal in the last 72 years for Czechoslovakia, and you'd have to go find the page.
That's right. We have a whole book on the opening ceremony, and in the Summer Olympics, it's more than 200 nations. And whoever the co-host was, Dick Enberg, Matt Lauer, Katie Couric, I would say, okay, I'll take Latvia, you take Lithuania. And we used to call it tidbit ping pong, because in some cases, there was something meaningful and insightful you hope to say. And in other cases, you're just searching around for something. And I know I said through all those opening ceremonies through the years, more than once, the only thing I had on Bolivia was that was where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid met their end. Finally, David, I got to the point. I was always kind of grousing behind the scenes. You know what? The opening ceremony is taking 50% of my energy for preparation for the entire Olympics. This is not really time efficient. Get someone else to do this. It's a loser's game anyway, because it's a combination of high church and some sort of United Nations assembly meeting, but also Cirque du Soleil with absurd aspects of it. If you try and be a little flippant and a little sarcastic, that pisses some people off.
Could start a war.
Right. If you treat it, with complete solemnity, other people say, come on, lighten up a little bit. I don't think I could ever find the exact sweet spot for it. Some people are really cut out for parades and circuses and that kind of stuff. And I'm not hostile to it, but I don't know that it's a perfect fit for me. So toward the last 3 Olympics I did, I asked off. I was in the studio. I sent it out to somebody else. They handled that burden. And Can
we go back to the draft, please, Bob? You drafted countries with Lauer. You sat there with Katie Couric and you had a list of all the countries. Was it a snake draft? How exactly did you do a draft of preparation?
Well, generally speaking, you didn't want the other person to be absent for like 20 minutes. You didn't have to go alternately. You didn't have to go, Latvia, Lithuania. Maybe I'm leaving something out in between the LA and the LI. But anyway, you didn't have to go 1 for 1. Maybe I'd take a run of 3 or 4, and then the other person would do the same. And there might be a circumstance where one or the other of us would say, I really have something about Romania that I want to say. Or I really have something here. Like, give me China. I got plenty of stuff here.
Did you not do it according to how easy it was to pronounce last names? Why wouldn't that be how the draft would go?
It might have been a consideration, but generally speaking, if I didn't know how to pronounce the person's name, they didn't either. So we had to turn to the researchers. So there was a huge, voluminous pronunciation guide. Uh, but sometimes those names were challenging for us.
So what's the best thing? What's the worst thing that's changed then? If we say research, you're not really saying that the amount, you're saying the amount is more, but really you're saying the ease in which you can get it while you're on the air
Yeah.
is what has changed.
And I think also it's incumbent upon the broadcaster and a seasoned researcher or stat person to make their way through the thicket of information. Just think about this in baseball and say, wait a minute, which of these is just a number? It may be a fact, but is it interesting? What does it prove? And I'm not trying to put the knock on anybody, but now with all this stuff available, you and I watching baseball hear this all the time. It's the first time that two members of the Detroit Tigers have had five or more home runs and five or more triples within the first 45 games of the season. Now, that may be a fact. What the bleep does it mean? It means nothing. Now, if you're talking about Soto and Judge, that who have some combination of statistics to this point in the season that are better in some respects than Ruth and Gehrig in any season, that's kind of interesting. I have to be the last line of defense. I'm the goalie here. Does this make sense? Does this get through? Give me what you got. Now I've got to decide how
But
to
who
hit
are
it.
you talking to? Are you talking to fans? Are you talking? It has to change depending on the event. In the World Series, you're talking to people who don't watch any other games.
Yes, that is a
So,
very astute observation. And let's say the Braves are playing the Yankees in the World Series as they did twice in the 90s. I did the second of those two in 1999. I know that there are some Brave fans who know everything there is to know about Keith Lockhart. Forget about Chipper Jones or Tom Glavine or Greg Maddux, about Keith Lockhart. But someone in Tacoma not only doesn't know much about Keith Lockhart, they don't know who the hell he is. And
or
so it's,
Chipper Jones.
well, maybe. So, especially in the first couple of games, you've got to set the scene, lay out what the narrative of the season has been, what the dynamics are between the two teams that may seem like an oversimplification for avid fans of the two teams, but it's necessary for a national broadcast.
Do you like that part of your job? I was
Yeah,
just thinking, would you rather do a broadcast in front of a bunch of people who know a lot or people who don't know anything?
well, almost everything that I've done, I don't think you're addressing that most of the audience doesn't know anything, but most of what
I'm
I've done,
saying be
yeah,
interested. I don't want to offend the audience. I'm talking about people who are watching one of your events who are
yeah,
watching it because it's a moment, not
yeah,
because they're a fan of the sport.
yeah. I think where that most applies to the greatest degree is the Olympics. Because when you think about it, almost every sport that makes up the Olympics, almost, would be a niche sport outside of that once every 4 years. So if some aficionado of pole vaulting is upset because we do a feature about some young man or woman from Pendleton, Oregon, who all of a sudden finds themselves on the biggest global stage and we have to do a background and they want to know everything about the most minute technique of the pole vault, well, that person makes up 2-3% of the audience. We've got to broaden it out, not just from an information standpoint, but from an engagement standpoint. You can overdo anything, you can overplay any hand, but the idea of up close and personal is a valid idea unless it's pushed too far, especially for the Olympics, because you have to give people a reason to care, a reason to be invested in it. What's the storyline here? Now, if you're talking about baseball, football, basketball, then the difference between the biggest events and the regular season games or whatever led up to the Super Bowl or World Series is only a matter of degree. You don't have to tell the audience who Tom Brady or Peyton Manning is. They've followed that enough. But there are still some people that are coming in for the Super Bowl or for the World Series, to your point. And so you've got to catch them up a little bit. Almost everything I've done broadcast wise, other than my first few years in St. Louis and 1 year in Syracuse, has been a network broadcast. So I've never had that, or virtually never had that idea of we, so that it isn't that the other team won, we lost, or vice versa. I'm trying to present it in an entertaining and informative way.
Are you saying
For
you've never been a homer?
I've never been a homer. No. I
And
mean,
do you
I
believe
was
do homers bother you?
no, no. To each their own. And if you're Harry Carey in Chicago, that's who you are. Now, Vin Scully always said, "I don't root," and he was the professional's professional. But with the Dodger Stadium crowd behind him, you know, the way he broadcast the game reflected that. He never said we. He never openly rooted. But obviously, it's better for him if the Dodgers win. What most people don't understand watching a network broadcast is that, with few exceptions, what the network announcer hopes for is the best possible game and the best possible series. So if a best of seven starts out with one team up 2-0, you hope the other team wins game three. But you don't let that, if you're good at your job, you don't let that seep into the way you broadcast the game, except to note that if they lose this game, their backs are against the wall. You have to be appreciative of both teams, and you have to reflect also what's happening in the ballpark. What a lot of fans don't understand is they're rooting for their team, and maybe their team is on the road. So their team does something great, and the crowd response is muted. The other team does something great, and the place goes nuts. And you have to raise your voice to get over that. But they're used to listening to their guy, and that's fine. That's why I've always said they have the technology now to do it. You can do a Manning cast on Monday Night Football. Why can't they, during the World Series, say, let's say the Giants played the Mets in the LCS, not the World Series. Giants played the Mets in the LCS. You got some of the best broadcast teams in local television. Gary Cohen, Keith Hernandez, Ron Darling with the Mets. You've got John Miller on the radio with the Giants and Kruko and Kuiper on TV. Why, since the technology allows for it, can't fans in those cities or for whatever reason around the country who want to hear those broadcasters tap into that as well as the network broadcasters? They'd be using the same feed. They'd be using the network feeds that have to react to their pictures, and they'd have to play the network commercials. You just cobble it all together for ratings purposes and for selling advertising. Why not? Then you take the complaint away, because every single time, every World Series, every NBA final, every big football game, fans of both teams think the network announcers are rooting against their teams. It's a standing joke. In 1986, during the Red Sox-Mets World Series, an epic World Series, Vin Scully, paragon of professionalism, and Joe Garagiola doing the World Series. And there was one night, this is before Twitter and everything else, there was one night when the NBC switchboard logged 800 complaints from apparently Red Sox fans saying that the announcers were rooting for the Mets and dissing the Red Sox, and 1,000 roughly on the other side. I would attribute the difference only to the fact that, well, Boston's a big city, New York's an even bigger city. Hearing exactly the same words, so it's a standing joke, and all you can do is try and do the best possible job by your own lights, and then let the chips fall where they may.
I always had debates with our broadcasters about being a homer because I always wanted credibility, but on the other hand, don't criticize the owner. So it was always important when I communicated with our broadcasters that I wanted our fans to believe that we were independent, but that nothing our owner did was ever bad.
I think that you've hit upon something there. There's a little bit of truth in that, even though it's kind of flippant on what you said, because I think the average team owner, or if it's a network executive, national broadcast, you can criticize, but don't go someplace that cuts too close to the bone. That's where I got into a little bit of trouble, but I consider it to be good trouble with the NFL. You could this guy got suspended for using performance enhancing drugs. This guy got in a domestic violence situation. This franchise may move. But when all the CTE stuff reached critical mass, that goes to the very nature of the game. And I was willing to talk about that. And I think that cut too close to home for some people.
Do you think that Barkley's going too far right now? Have you seen him
Yeah.
and what he's saying about TNT and about Zaslav? And to
Yeah.
me, boy, he's taken his power for a walk to see how big it is. I'll tell you that.
He's bulletproof.
Is
He's
anybody? Wait, hold on. Who is? Have you ever met Have you ever seen anyone in your career that was truly bulletproof?
Well, he's as close to it as just about anybody. Maybe John Madden would have been. I think most broadcasters are there, and if they're good, they enhance the enjoyment. Vin Scully certainly did. Local
Hmm.
broadcasters, especially true. Harry Carey in his own way in Chicago. Jack Buck in St. Louis. We're thinking baseball here.
Hmm.
Scully. Um, but Barkley, on a national basis, is as close to indispensable as anyone I can think of. And he knows that if he wants to, wherever basketball winds up, he can go. Everyone will want him. It might not be the same as inside the NBA with Ernie and Shaq and Kenny Smith, along with Barkley, but he can go wherever he wants to go and he'll be welcomed. And if somehow TNT retains the NBA, no one there is going to say, well, screw him. We don't like what he said. Screw him. Talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face. That would be the case in that instance.
But then, according to you, if you've got the power and you've got the audience, then there is no limit. You just said try not to go too close to the bone. I don't know how Barkley could be closer to the bone with what he's doing, thinking as an executive. I'm not sure what he could say other
Yeah.
than my wife is ugly. Like, I don't know what is more
Yeah.
personal than what he's done.
Yeah. Of course, unless you're Donald Trump and you insult every other Republican, and in some cases, their wives and their fathers, and they all still turn around and kiss your ass.
But
That's an
those are the
interesting.
voters.
The voters, but also his handmaidens within the Republican Party and in MAGA media. This is an incredible dynamic there, where at least to that world, certainly not to those who see him for what he is, but to that world, there's almost nothing he can do to forget about tick them off and get them to oppose him. There's almost nothing he can do that will remove their lips from his ass.
So now what I'm thinking is when we're talking about what the biggest change is, and we're talking about from the 70s, 80s to today, maybe
Uh-huh.
it's that. Maybe it's that Barkley or Pat McAfee have the power that did not exist in those days. Because I
Yeah.
don't, the names you've mentioned are legendary Hall of Fame, best in the business, as are you. I'm not sure, and I say this with love and more respect than you'll ever know. I'm not sure you ever had the power that Pat McAfee has right now.
Oh, no, I didn't. Almost no one did. Uh, because McAfee is an independent contractor. The networks, in this case ESPN, are searching around for means to cope with and maybe get ahead of the rapid changes within the business,
Hmm.
YouTube, streaming, whatever it might be. So they make a deal with McAfee, who I don't watch on anything close to a regular basis, but I understand that there's some sort of disclaimer at the beginning that says this is not produced by ESPN, et cetera, et cetera.
Like the
But he
sports reporters.
yeah, but like he came close to it with Caitlin Clark. He was trying to be complimentary, but he spoke in his way, and he had to back off from that, and he apologized directly to Caitlin Clark. I imagine that there is something or some things that someone like McAfee could do in terms of not so much ticking off management, but if they said something that was deeply offensive or bigoted, that a large consensus of people found deeply offensive, um, that might spell the end, or at least take a toll on that person's career.
Do you not think that one of the biggest changes from the beginning of your career to now is how much more careful you have to be with the when the red light is on? Or were you always thinking the way you think today when you first started your career?
The word irreverent was practically attached to my name
So it's strange. It's
at the beginning. I remember someone wrote, he's got a David Letterman side and a Brian Gumble side. And someone else said he's reverent and irreverent at the same time. And I took those things as compliments that I very much appreciated. Um, you know, Maybe I wasn't bombastic in the way I expressed myself, but I think I was always willing to try and bring a journalistic aspect to it to the extent that I could, and to make legitimate observations. But I was never a potshot guy. I didn't take personal shots at
No,
people.
I don't. And I'm not talking about pot shots. I'm talking
Yeah.
about woke, political correctness, all
Yeah.
the adjectives people want to use. People have said cancel culture, whatever adjective, and I don't want to put a name to any of it, only
Yeah.
because there's too many names to describe it. But that's clearly different now than when you were broadcasting the
Yes.
'94 finals.
Yes. I was only on with Johnny Carson one time. Trust me, this is going someplace in answer to your question. Only on with Johnny Carson one time. Lucky enough to be on with Letterman, Conan, Leno many times. But I really wanted to be on, as everybody did, at least one time with Johnny Carson. And Johnny, when our paths had crossed, was always very nice and very gracious to me. So a month before he left the Tonight Show in '92, I'm on. And I think I was the third guest, but I was just thrilled to be there. And everybody's got 5 or 6 good minutes. So I figured I better unload the 5 or 6 good minutes. And it went really well. And Johnny's laughing. And, you grow up watching Johnny Carson. Now he's wrapping that pencil on the desk, and you look back toward him and his eyes are always locked in on yours. I mean, it's a whole Johnny Carson thing that only people of a certain generation or two would understand. So it went great. And I told this story that's legendary in St. Louis circles about a woman who was billed as Miss Cheesecake, who came into the booth sometime in the '70s when it was National Dairy Day at Busch Stadium. And the broadcasters were Jack Buck, Mike Shannon, and Bob Starr. And Miss Cheesecake sashayed into the booth, and she had with her 3 little individual boxes of cheesecake as a goodwill offering from the National Dairy Association for the broadcasters. And it's kind of a loose broadcast, et cetera, et cetera. And it led to an incredible faux pas on the air, where the question had been posed, what do you think of Miss Cheesecake? And one of the announcers thought he heard, what do you think of this cheesecake? And his answer produced uproarious laughter and a story which for years I told at banquets to great approval, applause, laughter. Everybody loved it. And I told it to Johnny Carson. And the audience went crazy. And Johnny threw his head back. And it's Johnny Carson. He goes, oh, that's a great story. Okay? Tremendous. I wouldn't come within a mile of that story today. It just isn't. Is it still funny? Sure it is. Would I tell you the story over dinner? Yes. Is it silly to be so politically correct? Of course it is. But it isn't worth the surus to go through it. It just isn't worth it. So I wouldn't do it. And I don't even think that you go in and think about these things specifically. You just internalized, kind of
Well, you have a governor. That's the
how the
difference.
have changed. I want to come back to one thing you mentioned before. I share your point of view that, and I've always said this, if you are not willing to judiciously and fairly be either critical or ask pointed questions, then the audience is less apt to believe you when you're praising someone or when you're saying, which is what you want to transmit to the audience, wish you were here. This is great. What an atmosphere. So much excitement. This is wonderful. And I felt that way very often broadcasting a game. I'd like to think that people gave that more credibility because they knew I wasn't bullshitting them.
So let me bring you inside a meeting. I guess this was, let's say, the teens, maybe. I was
Uh-huh.
still the president of the Marlins, and we were talking about broadcasters, and your name came up.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I think about your name is that you were, again, the voice of my life in a mostly positive, actually in a totally positive way, where I
Mostly,
would actually mostly positive.
I think
You're
mostly.
you're associated with some losses, but very, very positive. And what came up is that, and you've heard a little bit of this recently, and it's interesting that you just struck a nerve. You gained credibility by being honest about what you were seeing in a sport that didn't always want honesty about what was being seen.
Yes, that's true.
And that is a subtle difference between you and what I would call newer people who get their jobs by making sure that they're only going to say what the commissioner's office, what the owners, and what GMs, what they want to be said, whether it's about prospects. And this was always a big one, that we
Mhm.
would manipulate broadcasters. And I say that with love and respect to all of them, when we wanted to talk up certain players because we knew we wanted to trade them. what do? You meet with the broadcasters because you've got opposing GMs and scouts watching the games. And
Uh-huh.
they often do what I did. I watched visiting team feeds. I didn't need to hear I had a staff
Yeah,
listening to our feed. I wanted to hear what the other guys were saying. And
yeah,
so you
interesting.
were never willing. You were never a participant in those games.
No, but I never worked for a local team, except when I did the Spirits of St. Louis of the ABA for 2 years.
No, but
And
even nationally, Bob, it
played.
came up. We talked about it from a national standpoint too, though, where there were things that would be said that we would not want to be said, the way they were being said, and we would try to manipulate it.
Yeah,
And
I
it had to
understand
have
that.
come across your desk before.
I think though, this is very gratifying for me. You know, we all make mistakes, or we all have regrets where we'd like to go back. And even if it wasn't bad, it could have been better in some way. But generally speaking, I think the audience perceived that I genuinely loved baseball, that I genuinely reveled in the genuine excitement of the Michael Jordan era in the NBA, that I understood and appreciated what the Olympics represent at their best, even as I asked pointed questions of the presidents of the IOC. I think the audience, by and large, is smart enough to hold two or more truths in their head at the same time. So Bob is a sports broadcaster, and hopefully a good one, we hope. But also, there's a journalistic aspect to what he does, and an observer's aspect. And if it's rendered skillfully and judiciously, that should be part of it. You may have heard me say this before. I think that a great sports broadcast, maybe not every one because it doesn't allow for it, but over time, what my objective was to have my presentations have the qualities that a very good edition of the old Sports Illustrated would have:
Mhm.
a celebration of sports, an appreciation of the beauty and drama and theater of it, some humor, some personality, and bringing out the quirkiness of and the character of the participants, but also some commentary and journalism. Not always in the same proportion, but over time, it should have that kind of texture. And I hope that what I did, at least the best of it, had a different texture to it than some other broadcasters,
Do you
even though I respect those other broadcasters.
do you miss your show?
The late night show?
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
funny it's funny the way you're talking. It makes it sound I'm having visions of your late night show.
And it has a second life now on YouTube. And people will say to me, "Hey, I saw you last night with Tony Perkins." And my first thought when I first started hearing this is, what was it, a seance? Isn't Tony Perkins dead? Isn't Dennis Hopper dead? But now there's hundreds of them out on YouTube. And some of them I remembered specifics of, others I did not. And I look back now uh, on that as one of my great regrets, not doing the show, but leaving it when I did. I left it after 6 years in early 94. The network wanted me to stay. It had been nominated for Emmys each of the last few years of the show and won it in the last year in its category. And that's a tribute to the whole staff and the producers and researchers as well. But at that time, my kids were very young. I'm commuting between St. Louis and New York. I'm doing everything of importance at NBC Sports, much the way Mike Tirico is now. I was involved in all the big properties and I was
Mhm.
enjoying it. Something had to come off the plate, and there was a lot of preparation involved in doing that show as well as we endeavored to do it. So I reluctantly stepped away from it. But in retrospect, I could have stayed, not indefinitely, but I could have made those 6 years, 10 years, or even 12. And people say to me now, could you go back and do that show? No, for two big reasons. One, I wouldn't have the energy to do it now. But two, almost every guest that came on the show, sometimes you just need a guest for Tuesday night, and it might not be anything that really exemplified what the show aspired to be. But by and large, I had some sense of almost every guest. The research helped me to flesh out what I knew about them. but many of them I could have interviewed pretty well off the top of my head because I was familiar with their body of work. And I think my sensibility was pretty close to the cultural bullseye at that time. So today, could I interview Drake and do it competently? Could I interview Taylor Swift and do it competently? Yes. But I would not have the same affinity for it as interviewing Smokey Robinson or Paul Simon or Carole King. I was connected to all that stuff, and then I just brushed up through the preparation. That
Who
I
do you,
did from almost from my heart as well as my head. Whereas now I would just do it from my head.
who do you see as the broadcaster today who most resembles you from those early 90s days?
From a play-by-play standpoint, a couple of Syracuse guys I could cite. There are similarities between me and Sean McDonough and Ian Eagle. And Ian Eagle's son, Noah, who also went to Syracuse, sportscasting warehouse. He is probably the best young sportscaster at his age that I've heard since Joe Buck was in his middle 20s. I don't know that there's an exact match, nor should they be. Should there be? When I say an exact match, there are people who are as good in their own way or better. But if you have any distinctiveness at all, then someone else shouldn't come along who's a carbon copy of you, because you bring, hopefully, not just craftsmanship to it, you bring something of who you are to it. And I think, and all these things, it's not a regret. I'm just responding to your questions. There was a very long and fortunate run for me from, let's say, the mid 80s to around 2010, where almost everything I did on NBC, in and out of sports, and then on HBO, stuff for NBC News, even some of the entertainment stuff, the late night show, everything I did didn't just suit whatever skill I had, but it spoke accurately about me as a person. It said something about me as a person, not just as a craftsman, that resonated with me and with the audience. And since then, the percentage of times that's been true is less.
Well, you may not realize how long your tail is. We did a show with Ariel Helwani, who is the leader of MMA Media, if you know that
Uh-huh.
name.
I do.
And he is a Syracuse guy, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, when he was listing why he is who he is today, and this was totally coincidental, he didn't know that you and I were going to be sitting
Yeah.
down to do a show. Your name was mentioned in a very small list. It was two or three people
Mm-hmm.
total who made him decide what he wanted to do. And it's not as though you're a donor and you've got 4 million kids walking around, but I will say there are people doing jobs with microphones who use you as their North Star. What a powerful thought that is. I just was thinking about that.
Yeah, I hope they're focusing on like 1985 to 2010. I think since then the results are a bit more uneven for a variety of reasons. But I think, for that, what would that be? Quarter century stretch. That stuff was pretty true to who I was, not just as a professional, but as a person.
You talked to me once off the air about uneven and your concern about a show of yours or a game that you called as being uneven. And it's
Uh-huh.
interesting that your ear may not be as accurate as you think it is, because what you are saying is uneven. My guess is you took from 4 or 5 Twitter comments as
No,
opposed to the reality of the quality of the broadcast.
no. Here's how I feel about Twitter comments, or now X. It's a thing. It exists. It can be noted, perhaps, where it's relevant, but a combination of laziness, stupidity, and or cynicism causes some people in the media, usually on sites on the internet, to treat Twitter or X as if it's a pew poll, as if it's some kind of valid consensus. You don't take a dozen comments on a Marlins fan site if the Marlins, let's say, got to the World Series, and then say Joe Blow calling the World Series vilified by Marlin fans.
Can
You
I
can
introduce you to owners and to heads of
insane.
media companies who don't agree with you? And I totally agree with you. You'd be shocked how many people read X comments and view it as the portal to reality.
Well, that's a sad state of affairs. And these aggregators who don't even bring to bear any discernment of their own, whether you would agree or disagree with their opinion, they just aggregate. They write a few semi-literate sentences to frame it in some cases, sadly, and then they just lay out these tweets. Or they take they can do it right here. They could take 45 seconds of this, lift it out of context, absent the tone, the antecedent, make a response to a question seem as if it's a proclamation that I wrote in here on a white horse dying to make. That happens all the time, and it's emblematic. Does it matter that much in and of itself? No. On the worst day of my professional life, I've been more fortunate than 99% of the people out there, and I never lose sight of it. But so I'm just a grain on the beach, a grain of sand on the beach when it comes to this. But if you're a geologist, you can look at that grain of sand and tell people what the beach is like. And some of what I could relate and you could relate as examples of what we're talking about may not be that important insofar as it directly affected you or me. But it is important as something that leads you to a larger conclusion about the misinformation and disinformation and idiot's echo chamber in which so many people live.
That is the perfect way to end. Thank you for your time. I will end it by saying thank you. We're not going to wait 2 more years and say it's just business. You've been watching Nothing Personal.